Αγαπητοί φίλοι, καλησπέρα σας. Εκ μέρους του Διοικητικού Συμβουλίου του Μουσείου Γουλανδρή Φυσικής Ιστορίας, σας καλωσορίζω και σας ευχαριστώ για την παρουσία σας στην ομιλία του κύκλου που έχει θέμα την κλιματική αλλαγή, το μεγαλύτερο περιβαλλοντικό και όχι μόνο πρόβλημα που απασχολεί την παγκόσμια κοινότητα, καθώς απειλεί άμεσα πολλές και σημαντικές πτυχές της ζωής στον πλανήτη. Ως Μουσείο Φυσικής Ιστορίας έχουμε ιδιαίτερο ενδιαφέρον, αφού τα οικοσυστήματα, ωκεανοί, δάση, ουρότοποι, διαδραματίζουν σημαντικό ρόλο στην αλλαγή του κλίματος, απορροφώντας περίπου τις μισές ανθρωπογενείς εκπομπές διοξιδίου του άνθρακα. Επομένως, είναι πολύ σημαντικό να τα διατηρήσουμε σε καλή κατάσταση, αν θέλουμε να πετύχουμε ανάσχεση της κλιματικής αλλαγής. Φέτος, σχεδιάσαμε ένα τριετές πρόγραμμα για την υποστήριξη δράσεων με επίκεντρο την κλιματική αλλαγή, ειδικότερα στην Ελλάδα, με βάση τα πορίσματα της Επιτροπής Μελέτης Επιπτώσεων της Κλιματικής Αλλαγής, ΕΜΕΚΑ, της Τράπεζας της Ελλάδος, με την οποία το Μουσείο υπέγραψε μνημόνιο συνεργασίας. Στο πλαίσιο αυτό, είναι χαρά και τιμή μας να έχουμε απόψε καλεσμένο ομιλητή τον Robert Pollin, διακεκριμένο καθηγητή Οικονομικών στο Πανεπιστήμιο της Μασσαχουσέτης Άμερστ, συνδιευθυντή του Ερευνητικού Κέντρου Πολιτικής Οικονομίας Πέρι, συντονιστή προγραμμάτων πράσινης ανάπτυξης στον ΟΗΕ και σύμβουλο της Πολιτείας της Νέας Υόρκης για το σχεδιασμό μιας δίκαιης μετάβασης στην πράσινη ανάπτυξη. Το 2013 το περιοδικό Foreign Policy τον ανέδειξε σε έναν από τους 100 κορυφαίους στοχαστές στον κόσμο. Στην ομιλία του, ο καθηγητής Pollin θα μας δείξει γιατί μια δίκαιη μετάβαση στην πράσινη οικονομία είναι αναγκαία για την κλιματική σταθεροποίηση, αλλά και την ανάπτυξη. Επίσης, έχουμε τη χαρά και την τιμή να έχουμε ομιλήτρια τη Φοίβη Κουντούρη, καθηγήτρια στο Οικονομικό Πανεπιστήμιο Αθηνών και πρόεδρο της Ευρωπαϊκής Ένωσης Οικονομολόγων Περιβάλλοντος. Θα μας μιλήσει για τη μετάβαση στη βιώσιμη ανάπτυξη που έχει ήδη αρχίσει και για το ερώτημα αν θα γίνει η μετάβαση αυτή αρκετά γρήγορα, εγκαίρως. Συντονιστής της εκδήλωσης είναι ο δημοσιογράφος Παύλος Τσίμας, γνωστός για τη βαθύτερη γνώση του σε πολλά θέματα, την κρίση του και την ικανότητα να χειρίζεται τα θέματα που καλείται να συντονίσει σε αντίστοιχες εκδηλώσεις. Τους ευχαριστούμε πολύ για τη συμμετοχή τους. Αγαπητοί φίλοι, η δημιουργία οικολογικού προβληματισμού και η οικολογική συνείδηση είναι απαραίτητες προϋποθέσεις για την επιτυχία των στόχων μας. Το Μουσείο, με την εκπαίδευση των νέων και την ενημέρωση του ευρύτερου κοινού, συντελεί στην κατεύθυνση αυτή. Για να μπορέσουμε όμως να επιβραδύνουμε και να αντιμετωπίσουμε τις επιπτώσεις της κλιματικής αλλαγής, ένας νέος κοινός σκοπός σε παγκόσμιο επίπεδο πρέπει να συγκροτηθεί. Χρειάζεται η σύμπραξη όλων μας, γιατί η ταχύτητα, το μέγεθος και η βιαιότητα της κλιματικής αλλαγής θα είναι δυσβάσταχτες. Η σημερινή μαζική συμμετοχή σας, που δείχνει το ενδιαφέρον σας και την επιθυμία σας να κατανοήσετε βαθύτερα τη μεγάλη αυτή πρόκληση, μας ενθαρρύνει και σας ευχαριστούμε θερμά. Να είστε βέβαιοι ότι αν με πίστη και ελπίδα το αποφασίσουμε όλοι μαζί, μπορούμε να πετύχουμε. Όλα πρέπει να υποχωρήσουν μπροστά στην επιτακτική ανάγκη να διατηρηθεί η ζωή πάνω στη γη. Σας ευχαριστώ.
Before I begin, I of course want to thank the organizers of this event, the museum. Having organized some events on my own, I know it's a lot of work, it's very difficult. It takes a lot of time, it takes more time, I'm sure, than I myself have done to prepare the lecture. So again, I want to thank people, and I want to thank Phoebe and Samaras, who was the one that initiated my visit, and I want to thank the director of the museum, Maria Pavliano, who unfortunately soon. So, yeah, the topic is the path to climate stabilization through a global Green New Deal. I just want to lay out briefly the terms of the problem, which I'm sure you are aware of, but I think it's worth reviewing. In last October, so a year ago, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the leading authority, a UN organization, leading authority which synthesizes research on climate change, came out with a new study, a new assessment of the degree of urgency on climate change. And myself, as somebody who's been following their research for at least a decade now, actually I found this new result, these new findings to be quite startling, in that it was much more higher level of urgency required in order for us to achieve a climate stabilization path than they had previously estimated. What they are saying now is that, number one, the goal for climate stabilization has to be that we stabilize the climate at 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels as of the year 2100. They had been saying that we could get away probably with stabilizing at 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Now they're saying we have to hit this 1.5 degree target. And they say if we fail to do so, if we don't hit that target, what we are facing are, as I have here, intensifying risks at the levels of heat extremes, heavy precipitation, droughts, sea level rises, and biodiversity losses. And I know from the meetings I had here in the museum that you have very important scientific work going on at the museum on biodiversity loss due to climate change and other factors. But these things will be exacerbated if we don't hit this 1.5 degree stabilization target. Now, the IPCC's October 2018 report also gave pretty clear targets that need to be achieved in order to have a realistic chance at hitting the stabilization targets. And they have more details, but I could summarize them. These are the two targets. That is, if we're talking about carbon dioxide emissions. Carbon dioxide emissions are not the only kind of greenhouse gas emission, but they constitute roughly 70%. So they are the main driver of climate change. And what the IPCC says is that in order to get to this this stabilization path of 1.5 degrees by the year 2100, we have to cut CO2 emissions by roughly 45% by 2030. Now that's only 11 years from now. And this is what they're saying. And this is, by the way, this is mainstream research. This is not kind of out on one side. In fact, there are, and I'm not a climate scientist, but there are climate scientists who say these estimates are not sufficient. That they are too lax in terms of their appreciation of the magnitude of the transition that must take place. But anyway, this is their target for 2030, and by 2050, roughly, basically 30 years from now, they're saying the globe has to be off of fossil fuels altogether, meaning no net zero emissions from fossil fuels by the year 2050. So that's the target. And what the modeling that I'm doing tries to show how we can accomplish this, difficult though it may be. These maps are just showing us some evidence with respect to the the magnitude of the ecological crisis that we're facing. So what this one shows is the globe, and the color scheme presents for us the extent of average temperatures being hotter than normal or colder than normal in different parts of the world. The strongest red parts of the map are showing us where in the world for the year 2017 we had the hottest year on record in 2017. And you see that consumes a reasonably large portion of the entire globe. The somewhat lighter red shows us much warmer than normal, and then the kind of pinkish red shows us warmer than normal. So basically what we're looking at is, you look at it, 90% of the Earth's surface experienced it in 2017, the most recent full year data, either the hottest year on record, much warmer than usual, or warmer than usual. And that's what we're going through now. Now, this next graph shows us the pattern. This is the global mean temperature, not regional mean temperature. This is the global mean temperature over time, from 1870 to 2017, where the blue bars in the bar graph are showing us years in which the global mean temperature is below average over the full period, 1870 to 2017. And the red bars are showing us the years over the average, above average. And you can see the pattern, obviously. So up until roughly 1930, or actually 1940, the global mean temperature was below average. Starting around 1980, as we see, we proceed with this upward trajectory to the point at which we are at almost 1 degree above the pre-industrial level. And that's, we're heading upward, and we're close to a 1.0 mean temperature above the pre-industrial level, with the target being we can't go any higher than 1.5. And we're clearly heading up. So this is to scare you. This is what we're looking at. And now I wanted to show you one final. Where are we in terms of the level of carbon dioxide emissions in the world now? And what if we follow a pattern similar to where we are, where would we end up by 2040? I'm using 2040 because at least as of this past year, another major agency that tracks this and provides us with modeling results is the International Energy Agency. And they present models, and so they do estimates of emission levels heading forward. And the most recent year was last year's study in which they stopped at the year 2040. That's why I'm giving you 2040 data. It turns out that they're going to come out with a new study in a month. I just got an email announcement about it today. So they may have a 2050 estimate, but anyway, let's look at the 2040. So the first bar there on the left shows us where the world is in terms of CO2 emissions, and that's at 32 billion metric tons. And I'll just say tons and drop the word metric, but we're 32 billion tons. Now, the International Energy Agency estimated, according to their most recent model, let's say the world proceeds as we are now. Let's say the levels of economic activity and of energy consumption of fossil fuels to drive world economic activity proceeds as we are now. By the year 2040, we are not going to see emissions go down at all. We will go up from 32 billion tons to 40 billion tons. In other words, if we believe climate science, the Earth is doomed. That's the finding. There's no way around it. Now, what if we try this next bar? Now, what are we showing with the next bar? This also is from the International Energy Agency, and this is another projection that they have. This projection shows us what will happen in the world if all the countries that signed on to the Paris 2015 Paris Agreement that was hailed as a historic breakthrough, and it was, in terms of 196 countries all agreeing to the terms of the agreement. What if everybody followed exactly what they said they were going to do at the Paris Agreement? Here's what happens to emissions. We do get lower than where if we just follow policies today, but we end up at 36 billion tons. Right now we're 32 billion tons. In 2040, we will be at 36 billion tons. Emissions will still go up. If everybody does what they said they were going to do in Paris, emissions still go up. I don't think this is widely known. The Paris Agreement, for all the, the strength of the rhetoric around it, is wholly inadequate, not close to being adequate in order to meet the challenge of climate stabilization. So what I have in the next two bars are what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says is what we need to do in order to hit the stabilization target. In other words, by the year 2030, we can't be at 36 billion tons. We can't be at 40 billion tons. We have to be at 16. We have to go from 32 billion tons now to 16. And by 2050, net zero. So that is the challenge. That's the challenge. What to do about it? Well, obviously there's a lot of complicated issues. There's a lot of debate. In my opinion, the basics are actually simple. Not all the details. The basics are simple. The basics include transitioning to a global economy that is driven on the basis on the energy sector by high efficiency and by renewable energy, clean renewable energy. Period. That's it. Invest in energy efficiency, invest in renewable energy, and we can achieve these targets. And what do I mean by efficiency? I mean all forms. Building efficiency, transportation efficiency, industrial efficiency. We operate, generally speaking, the global economy operates at levels of efficiency that can be improved by 30 to 40%, pretty inexpensively. In terms of energy substitution, when I talk about renewable energy, I'm talking about solar, wind would be the main sources, geothermal energy, some hydro at small scale hydro, and some bioenergy. We can get into the details. Now, how much? So we have this massive project ahead of us that is an imperative if we're serious about not threatening human life on Earth or our life on Earth. How large does the project have to be? So according to my own estimates with co-authors, and I will run through a little bit of how we do the model. The model is actually pretty simple. I'm not going to bore you with all the technical details, but I'll give you the basics. We estimate that investing roughly 2.5% of global GDP every year, and it has to be every year, and it has to be the global economy. No cheating, but you have to do 2.5% of GDP every year to build up the high efficiency and renewable sector. And if you do that, over the course of 30 years, you can actually run a 100% clean, renewable economy and do that while maintaining economic growth, while expanding job opportunities, and raising mass living standards. And that's critical. And that's why I call it the Green New Deal. Of course, I'm not the only one that calls it that, but at least that's the way I think about it. And I know some of you may not know the history of the term. The term comes from the United States in the 1930s and 40s under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the midst of the Great Depression and then World War II. And the idea of what we try to evoke with this term, the New Deal, is a growth project, an economic growth project that is also an egalitarian project. It also advances job opportunities, that reduces poverty, that expands opportunities, and that's the way what we're trying to capture with this concept of a global Green New Deal. Not just that we are going to hit the emission reduction target and transform energy systems, but we are going to do it in a way that also meets the needs of people in terms of incomes, in terms of jobs, and in terms of expanding budgets. And certainly in Greece, as we know very well, you all having suffered so much with the financial crisis and the aftermath, this is a project, this is a growth project. It is not an austerity project. It's an anti-austerity project. As part of the project, then, as we build the renewable energy economy, the fossil fuel energy economy contracts, such that in 30 years, we don't burn fossil fuels at all. We don't burn oil, coal, and natural gas at all. And that would mean roughly per year, every year, about a 3% reduction every year in our consumption of fossil fuel. Now that's it. That's the whole project. And so I think it's pretty simple. You know, I think as I've spoken in different groups, I think high school students can understand it pretty well. I think my 10-year-old granddaughter can understand it very well. So that's basically it. That's it. Everything else is detail. That's the project. So I'll give you a little detail, but you get the point. Now, what happens to the jobs and growth? As I said, the project is 100% compatible with the idea of expanding job opportunities and growth. As you all probably know, the European Union has their own project laid out, which they're calling climate neutrality by 2050. So they are developing their framework for doing the same thing that I'm talking about, which is reaching the net zero emission target by 2050, which they're calling climate neutrality. It's a good term. So climate neutrality meaning we're not going to screw up the climate any more than we already have by 2050, and we have to hit that goal. So this project that I'm talking about and the EU is talking about is fully consistent with growing the EU economy, with growing the Greek economy, with growing the US economy, and it is not incompatible. Now this is, as you can see here, contrary to what our president has been saying. So our president has been adamant. Number one, he's a climate change denier. He says he doesn't believe in science at all. And, you know, every time in the winter there's snowfall, he says, well, whatever happened to the idea of global warming? We have snow. Now that is serious scientific evidence. The other part of the story is the part that resonates very actively with different segments of the population, is that, well, you know, this climate stuff, there may be something to it, but what about jobs? What, you know, who don't these environmentalists care about the coal miners? What about the fossil fuel, you know, the oil workers? And these are good jobs. Now you're going to take away all these jobs of these people because of some crackpot theory. This is the kind of thing he says. And it resonates. People hear it. And not only in the United States, elsewhere. So, it's very important, in my opinion, which is why I like the term Green New Deal. It's very important to show that our climate stabilization path is not incompatible with job creation, job opportunities, regional growth, economic growth. It is fully compatible. In fact, and I go through a little bit of the detail, it can be, the faster you grow, as long as you do 2.5% of GDP every year, you know, if you're growing faster, that 2.5% is more money. And therefore you pour more into the transition to a green economy. So the approach is also contrary to some framework that has been developed, especially in Europe, called degrowth, which is, as the name suggests, is basically, the opposite side of the Trump position, but ends up kind of in the same place, which says, yes, in order to achieve climate stabilization, we cannot have economic growth. So we have to begin a voluntary contraction of the economy. So the two sides of this argument are the kind of denial position saying we're going to have a trade-off between jobs and climate. We'll take jobs. Jobs are more important to us than climate stabilization. The other side, the growth position, is we have a trade-off, inevitable and huge trade-off between jobs and climate. We'll take climate stabilization. And we'll figure out how to handle problems of economic contraction otherwise. Again, I find that position wrong, and I will explain that in a little more detail later. Okay, I'm going to just give you a snippet of how I work this simple model. What you see here are some estimates as to how much it costs to achieve a given level of energy efficiency relative to our existing energy systems. And obviously there's a lot of range all over the world. And there's a lot of different estimates. But if you look at the third column, I have estimates. The World Bank, looking at projects through 11 industrial and developing countries. I have an estimate from the McKinsey, which is the consulting firm. And they look at projects mainly in the developing world. And then I have one from the United States. And these numbers, what we're looking at are how much it takes to achieve savings as measured by the term is quadrillion BTUs, British thermal units. And there's different ways that we measure energy. You can talk about joules, or you can talk about kilowatts and all that, or a million tons of oil equivalent. There's different units. I personally like this BTUs because it's the simplest, and it cuts across all types of energy. And it's easy to understand once you say it. 1 British thermal unit, BTU. You light a match, let it burn down until it burns your finger. That's 1 BTU. Okay? The world economy today runs on about 550 billion quadrillion BTUs. So again, pretty round number. The United States economy runs today on about 100 quadrillion BTUs. Another nice round number. The Greek economy runs today on about 1.1 quadrillion BTUs. So easy to grasp and to work with. So let's think in those terms. Anyway, here's the range. The World Bank says you can get a savings of 1 quadrillion BTU, 1 cube BTU, with $2 billion. You invest in these efficiency measures, $2 billion. McKinsey says $11 billion. The National Academy of Sciences of the U.S., focusing only on the U.S., says $30 billion. Now, there's a big difference between $2 billion and $30 billion. Okay? Now, for my estimation, what I'm going to do, because I don't want to underestimate anything, I'm going to say to do this on a global scale to get 1 quadrillion BTU of savings through efficiency investment, I'm going to say it's going to be $30 billion. Ultra high-end estimate. Okay? That's number 1. That's the first key feature of my approach. The second one is spending on renewable energy, on solar, wind, geothermal, and so forth. And what we know now from the International Renewable Energy Agency is, as I quote from here, this study, basically they're saying that renewable energy is already at cost parity with fossil fuel energy, certainly in terms of generating electricity. In other words, we consumers, when we want to turn on the lights in our homes, and we do it with renewable energy, there is no reason to think that it's going to cost more. In fact, it is likely to cost less. And let me show you some of their evidence. So what are these bars? They have the cost of generating a kilowatt of electricity from different clean energy sources. If we focus for now on the kind of the yellowest, that's solar photovoltaic, and then the one with the purple at the far end, that's wind, onshore wind. Now then you see if you can see the rectangle, the gray rectangle that's running across. The gray rectangle running across is showing us the cost of fossil fuel electricity generation. So whenever you see the ranges for the renewable energies within that gray rectangle, that means you're at cost parity. That clean energy is at cost parity. Now, and I know that you're trying to get me, but I'm going to just go in point for a second. So these things, these dashed lines, those are showing us the average costs for the renewable energy sources. The first bar in each case is 2010, the second bar is 2017. So if you look for solar voltaic, from 2010 to 2017, the average cost has dropped from about 37 cents, right, to about 10 cents. You see that? This is in 7 years. So solar energy, on average, and we can get it, Greece should be able to go much lower than the average because you have a lot of sun. But on average, solar energy is at parity with fossil fuel energy today, with the cost coming down. And in fact, the International Energy Agency put out a new study again. I just got the email today, and they're saying solar energy costs are estimated are going down further, and it's the fastest growing source of energy in the world. Onshore wind, you see where they are, the two dashed lines. Onshore wind is at the low end relative to fossil fuel, right? Onshore wind is at maybe 7.5 cents. And you see the range for the fossil fuel is at somewhere between 15 and 5. So it is fair to say that once you build the renewable energy capacity, consumers will not have to pay more. They'll pay less because the costs of generating energy are at parity or lower, and we are investing in efficiency. And by efficiency, by definition, it means it takes less electricity to turn on the lights. It takes less energy to drive from point A to point B. So the clean energy system is cost effective. Forget about what it does for the environment for a second. It is cost effective. And so those are the two pillars of the model. You invest in the clean energy system, and you get energy at lower cost, and you are also building this clean energy system that is a building project. It's an infrastructure project. It therefore will create jobs. Okay, so I'm not going to go through, but in case anybody wants to ask, this is how I crank out the model. And the one thing I just want to show you is you can see when I say my cost assumptions, on energy efficiency, you can see I have it $30 billion per quadrillion BTU savings, which, as I said, was the extreme high end of those different estimates. And then I have a much higher number still to achieve 1 unit expansion of clean renewable energy. On average, I have it at $200 billion per unit of solar, wind, and so forth. And when you make those assumptions, where we end up, again, I'm not going to go through all the details. I can if you want to ask me at question time. Is that the top line, because of the investments in efficiency, total global energy consumption will fall from roughly 1,000 quadrillion BTUs to 430. We get a 60% reduction in demand by raising efficiency standards over a 30-year period, and investing the 2%, 2.5% of GDP in renewables, that we get almost 100% of that 430 billion quadrillion BTUs through renewable sources. And that's it. And therefore, we end up, if you look at the last row, these are emissions, the last two rows, emissions in 2050 would be 61 billion if the world proceeds according to where we're going now. And we're at 0. We've hit the emission reduction target. That's for investing 2.5% of GDP every year. Most of it in renewable energy, some of it in efficiency. What about jobs? Okay, well, I've done studies on different countries. I just did a very rough sketch of one for Greece. I think it's pretty good, but let me just show you for some of the other countries we've done. What you see are Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, the United States. Basically, the point is, when you invest in a clean energy economy, you create more jobs than if you were to spend the same amount of money in building up the fossil fuel economy. Roughly, you can see 2 to 3 times more jobs depending on the country. And that's because building the green economy requires more people. It's, as we say in economics, more labor intensive. It requires more people to do a given task. It's more labor intensive, and you therefore get more jobs. So the notion that this is bad for jobs has no basis, in fact. On average, you will get a lot more jobs. These are for countries that are big producers of fossil fuels. And we say, okay, if you're going to invest in more fossil fuels or you're going to invest in green energy, this will be the impact on jobs. Now, then there's another type of country that is primarily importing its fossil fuel energy, and Greece is among them. As you know, Greece does produce coal, but it imports all of its oil, or mostly all of its oil, and mostly all of its natural gas. So what about countries that are import dependent on fossil fuel? So this would be the net job impact. I've done Spain, about 500,000 jobs per year, which is about 3% of the workforce. Puerto Rico, Greece. So my Greece number, it's along the same lines. So it's almost, on average, about 200,000 jobs per year, which accounts for 4% of the workforce. So if you, right now, you have a 17% unemployment rate, from the green investments, it doesn't end unemployment, you have to do other things, but it does take a whack at it. It does get it from 17% to 13% on average. Okay, some other features in terms of what we achieve with the Green Energy Stabilization Project. Who's going to own the green energy? We're building up a whole new industry massively, obviously. And so the question is, should it be public ownership, should it be private ownership? Well, first of all, we need to understand and be clear, just as the case in Greece with the ownership of the coal sector, 90% of the fossil fuel energy is already under public ownership. So if the solution to a climate stabilization problem were simply public ownership, we would have already gotten there, and we aren't getting it. So public ownership alone is not the solution to climate stabilization. It could be part of the solution, but we also then have to transform our public ownership sectors. They have to change their model. But at the same time, I think it's important to realize that the green economy is going to offer major opportunities for all kinds of new ownership forms. New public ownership, new private ownership, and some combinations. Cooperative ownership, and I know there's a burgeoning, small still, but burgeoning cooperative green energy ownership movement here in Greece. I've been reading about it. Why is green energy compatible with smaller scale ownership? Because the operations don't require, you do not get big benefits by going massive scale. You know, putting solar panels on roofs is not, you become your own energy provider. You don't have to have the gigantic utility, burning coals, digging coal from the pit, transitioning it to all over the country. You can have small-scale cooperative ownership. You can have solar panels on roofs, and therefore ownership forms become much more fluid. So it creates opportunities for all kinds of small businesses. In addition, it creates opportunities for what we call distributed energy. And again, this thing that I just got an email today from the International Energy Agency emphasized the opportunity for so-called distributed energy, which means energy systems completely off the grid. A solar panel on your roof is an example. If you generate your own electricity, you don't have to be on the grid at all. And these kinds of systems can be, very, very beneficial, especially in places that have had difficulty in building a grid. I was doing work in sub-Saharan Africa a year ago. 40% of the rural areas have no electricity today. So to say that, oh, gee, we're getting there, we're close, they're not getting there. It doesn't work. On the other hand, building small-scale distributed energy systems in rural areas is a massive opportunity. It's also, when we think about the non-interconnected islands here in Greece, that's also another place, an example where this could be a really massive new opportunity. Okay, jobs. Now, as I said, there are huge net gains in terms of job opportunities. That said, of course there will be job losses. And those are job losses in the fossil fuel economy. There's no denying it. If you're going to drive oil production, coal production, natural gas production to zero, then that means that people are employed in those sectors won't have their jobs. That's a given. So what do we do about that? We have to do a lot. We have to be committed. And that's certainly true in the US. It's true in Greece. The jobs in the coal sector and the regions that depend on these are important, and that therefore what we need is what we call a just transition. We have to be, as part of the overall project of clean energy, Green New Deal transformation. Again, the Green New Deal is supposed to mean that we are committed to an egalitarian version of climate stabilization. And that means we have to be committed to just transition for the sectors of each economy, including Greece, where they are now dependent on their jobs. And the communities depend on these, in Greece, depends on coal. It's dirty, it's unhealthy, it's giving people cancer. There's still jobs, and they're pretty good jobs. And in a country, as you know, with 17% unemployment, still having a job that pays you and is stable is a big deal. So we have to be committed to supporting jobs, new job creation, wage guarantees, pension guarantees, community transitions. And we also have to be in terms of regional impact. We have to think about the regions, such as Western Macedonia. We have to think about new projects for those regions so that they don't collapse. The most obvious place to start is reclaiming the land, making the toxic land clean so that you don't have water contamination, and that you clean the land for other purposes, such as maybe putting up solar farms. That has to be central to the overall project, not just in Greece, everywhere. The other big losers, of course, the companies, public and private, that are committed to burning fossil fuels to generate energy. They are going to all go out of business. Again, there's no way around it. They're all going to go out of business. But if you look at the private, I'm talking now about the private companies, the estimates are that they're so-called unburnable assets. The oil, coal, gas in the ground equals about $3 trillion. They're going to lose $3 trillion. Well, then there are people who say, well, of course you can't do that. They'll never let that happen. Well, of course they're going to fight it. But we also have to recognize that $3 trillion over a, let's say, 20-year transition, or even a 30-year transition, is not that large. It sounds large, but it's, $100 billion to $150 billion a year in devaluation of these assets. That's not very big. The global valuation of the global financial markets are somewhere about 200 trillion. So to lose 150 billion, any smart investor can find another way to invest money, to move their money out of fossil fuels into something else. And that is what is going to have to be part of the story. So let me just mention about degrowth. I don't know if any of you have followed this debate about degrowth. I view their position as very well-meaning. I have a lot of respect for what they hold as the principles. And you can see I take a quote from this book, that degrowth recognizes that growth is uneconomic and unjust, it is ecologically unsustainable, and it will never be enough. So they say we need to stop worrying so much about growth and worry much more about living standards in some other broader sense. And again, I embrace the general principle, but let's just talk about it in terms of climate change. And again, this is some heavy math. This is really heavy math. Again, my 10-year-old granddaughter could grasp this in about 30 seconds. It's no big deal. In other words, we're at 32 billion tons of emissions. Let's say the global economy contracts by 10%. Now, you all in Greece know what that feels like. More than any place in the world. A 10% contraction. Devastating. It's called a crisis. Now, let's say we do that in the name of degrowth. Because we say, absolutely we have no choice. What do we get for this kind of economic devastation? Well, if you don't change anything else, you will reduce emissions by 10%. If you maintain the existing energy infrastructure and you just contract the economy by 10%, you will contract emissions exactly by 10%. It is no solution at all. Even if you believe in it fervently, that we're all wasteful, we shouldn't fly on airplanes. Rich people are driving cars that are too fancy, on and on and on. And again, I sympathize with a lot of it, but it is not a solution to climate. It is not. It's nowhere close. So if you want to get to zero emissions and you don't change the energy system at all, that means you can't have any economic activity. Okay? So it's something that they have not gone through. What the reality is that even under degrowth, you still have to transform the energy system. So what I'm actually talking about is massive growth of the clean energy economy. Investments in energy efficiency, investments in renewable, and creating the jobs that will be generated through this massive growth. At the same time, yes, we're going to degrow fossil fuels. Fossil fuels degrow to zero. But not everything else. Fossil fuels degrow to zero. Overall GDP can keep going. And, I think in Greece, I strongly favor things that will accelerate economic growth as long as you attach the clean energy investments to growth. So, financing, my last point. Where do we get the money to do all of this? Well, it's 2.5% of GDP. That means 97.5% of GDP can be doing things that more or less is going along now. But we still do have to come up with the 2.5%. That's over $1 trillion now, and as the economy grows, it'll be more. Well, this has to be led by the OECD, the rich Western European, US, Canada, Japan. They cause the problem, or I should say we cause the problem. We in the US, most of all, caused the problem by burning fossil fuels for 100 years at large quantities. So how do we do this? Well, the rich countries basically have to form something like a green investment bank, or I don't know if we're going to come up with any name, but they have to subsidize this 2.5% of GDP, not just in the United States, not just Western Europe, but globally. And that can be, if you want, we can get into details later. But take the example of Greece. The example of Greece, as you all know, Greece is faced by this requirement of running a primary government surplus of 3.5% of GDP every year. And on top of that, they have to pay interest. That comes to roughly 5%. I would argue that half of that needs to be forgiven now. And in forgiving that, you are being compatible with the EU's own project of climate neutrality by 2050. If the EU is serious about climate neutrality by 2050 as the top priority, that means you cannot force economies to operate under the austerity conditions imposed in Greece now. I will be talking about that more in detail tomorrow. I'm giving a lecture at University of Athens focused just on Greece. So if you are interested, you can come. I also have written a paper which will be available online, and you can read that. But that, speaking about Greece specifically, that has to be part of the picture. You can't expect Greece to hit these emission reduction targets if 5% of the economy gets shipped out every year, no matter what you do. Impossible. Okay, overall, I'd say, again, that climate stabilization is actually a realistic goal. The trajectories that we have don't get us close. If we are going to congratulate ourselves on the Paris Agreement, forget it. There is no hope of hitting a zero emissions target by 2050 just going by climate. Forgetting the fact that in the U.S., under our president, we've revoked our share of the agreement. But even if everybody followed, including the U.S., it's not good enough. We have to be doing something like a 2.5% investment per year project. And if we do that, the net impact will be to hit our targets, to create more jobs, to create new business opportunities, to bring energy to areas that have never had energy, low-income regions. It does not require austerity. It is an anti-austerity project. And we have to provide just transition for all the workers and communities that will face contraction under the Clean Energy Project. Overall, though, it is a viable project. It is an egalitarian project. It is a project that can work. Thank you.